Hi, Elisa.
Good morning, Laura.
How are you? I'm so pleased to have you today in the Humanitarian Initiative talks for quite a heavy topic, but quite an interesting one as well. We're going to talk about the dark side of the humanitarian sector and its heavy history. So thank you so much for accepting the invitation to join us this morning.
Thank you, Laura, for giving me this opportunity first to talk about that subject, which is a very important topic to me. And I'm really pleased that you invited me today to discuss with you about this really, let's say, interesting subject, but I would say as well a bit painful. And I think is like really nice to have this opportunity to talk with someone from the sector and having this a discussion about it. So really thank you for inviting me today.
You're most welcome. I'm so pleased that you're both a friend and a partner in the humanitarian sphere, and that together we're able to start difficult conversation and perhaps help others in the sector to first learn from that difficult conversation that we're going to have today, but also perhaps skill up their own ability to start and contribute to hard conversations in their own teams and in their own working environment. But first thing first, can you please introduce yourself, why you chose the humanitarian sector as a professional career, and how did you get where you are right now?
So first, my name is Elisa Piat. So I am a humanitarian worker since now 2014. So it's been 7 years that I've been working in this sector. I started to think about working in the humanitarian sector since a long time now. I studied international law in the university because I wanted to work in human rights and with organization working in conflict area. I was more willing to work on emergency context and conflict context and providing support to communities about their access to rights. So I started working in humanitarian organization just after my university. And then I went to several areas in Middle East, in Central Africa. And I worked as a different position. I started like working as reporting officers and then becoming a project manager and then a coordinator. So working in several different organizations at different positions in different areas and working in the field of first child protection, and then I specialize more in protection. So that's for my background. And since last year, I came back to France and I work now as an individual consultant, providing support and counseling to international organizations for their project in protection as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think this is important to stress the fact that for the purpose of this conversation today, that you're coming from a legal background and that you are centered about the individual's rights, community rights, and when they are affected by conflict, either directly or indirectly. And this is the background that we share. So I know how important it is to emphasize on this point. And I know also that this is what has driven your entire career, specializing in child protection at first, and then general protection for a bit of time right at the moment. And we often have discussions about how we should consider individuals and communities that we are attempting to support as rights holders, as people with their own rights, the fundamental rights and so on. And this is from that starting point that we're starting also today to start our topic, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Thank you for writing that, because this is really important. When I started working in humanitarian actions, to consider that we have a basis of our action, and these actions we have are based on the rights and international law, and that's why we are intervening in some countries. And to make the link, maybe for the today's topic, I'm always analyzing context where I intervene in with that framework, with that legal framework, thinking that we are there to implement projects for people to access their rights, having this, let's say, good intention, but in the, not at the contrary, but what happened is that during my last assignment and during, I think, all of my career, I had as well the feeling that despite this legal framework or despite this good intention, there were something wrong. To really put that in simple words, there were like issues with my values. There were like ethical issues I faced, and especially during my last assignment when I was working in Libya, where we had this really this project of protecting migrants, so based on the legal framework, but also we had these issues of having the fear of doing harm to migrants, to people. And there was this context of intervention, which was like really a mix between humanitarian objective, but we were facing as well a political lens, which was really hard to me to figure out, I mean, personally, what should I do? And I had the feeling that, okay, legal framework and the basis of my actions and what we were doing, the objectives was not enough. And we were struggling with other features, other political decisions and causes of this crisis, of this migrant crisis. And as a humanitarian worker, my action was not enough. So I started at that time to really think about, okay, I should take one step back and start thinking more deeper on my actions and take time to put some word on and to do some analysis of what was wrong with my work. And that's why I started working and doing my own research on the subject we will see today.
Yeah, this is really interesting. So I mean, we've shared a little bit of working time in Libya last year, I mean, in 2020, 2021. And as a protection professional, I really relate to what you're saying. And I think as a short introduction to those who are gonna either listen to this conversation or watch the recording of it, today's discussion is the fruit, the results of Elisa's research on the heavy history of the humanitarian sector and how it still runs through the system as it is today, and how this can enter in conflict with our own values, both as a professional, so in your case as a protection professional with a legal background and a legal lens to the work, but also as an individual, as a woman who has chosen to do humanitarian work and to support conflict affected communities and individuals. So this is this research was also triggered by your own personal experience, both on the professional side and the personal side, really acknowledging, visualizing, recognizing that there could be a gap between your intentions, your own values, and how you considered work, how you perceived good job, and how we should be doing, and what the reality of it is, how constrained you were in some ways, and how the external political sphere and interest and how the big world is running, and how that can trigger some friction, some either sometimes very distressing conflict of values that can lead to disillusion, even fatigue, exhaustion, burnout, and so on. This is all kind of linked together. But what has struck you the most is how the history of that sector is still playing today, and how the past of how framed the humanitarian system and assistance was thought and put in motion from the early years to now, and how this is still playing today. So one more time, thank you so much for sharing this condensated product of your research. It's really, really nice. I'm gonna leave you the floor for the a little presentation. I know you've prepared a nice PowerPoint. Guide us through all your knowledge, all your findings, and then we circle back to have to continue that conversation and brainstorm about that topic.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Okay, so let's start by sharing this presentation. Okay. Tell me if it's okay. Yeah, I think it's working.
Yeah,
huh?
it's fine. It's working.
Okay, great. Okay, so as Laura mentioned, so today we'll talk about the humanitarian sector, a heavy history, and this is really a quick overview we propose today about this huge topic. And this is based on the research and some documentation I've been reading since the past year. So as an introduction, we all know that this humanitarian sector has been criticized since a decade now. There were a lot of reforms, there were a lot of conferences about the humanitarian sector's issues in terms of process of, let's say, de-Westernization. There were a lot of thinking of how to improve our work. And I'm talking about like since 2005, reform of the humanitarian sector, how we put protection at the core of our work. I think this was also some advancement, some improvement of the humanitarian sector, how we put some standards to improve the quality of the sector. But since 2020, since the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, there were a huge call for decolonization into the humanitarian sector. And since that time, there are a lot of organizations, civil society movements, that they are questioning the power dynamics into the humanitarian sectors. And they are talking about the decolonization of humanitarian sectors, which is really interesting to think about this term first, because when we are talking about decolonization first, we think about, normally we think about the process of withdrawal of a state from one of its colonies and access to independence. So why we are talking about decolonization when we are talking about international organizations, which are not states, and with the humanitarian sector, which has, let's say, good intention. So I know it can be hard, let's say painful to talk about decolonization when we're talking about humanitarian sectors. And that's why we are here today, to understand why we can talk about that. And when we will talk about decolonization movements, we are here more talking about the process of deconstruction of colonialist ideologies and approaches. This is a secondary meaning of decolonization. It's more referring to deconstructing the colonial ideologies regarding the superiority and privilege of Western approaches. So we are talking about decoloniality of humanitarian aid sector, and we are really referring to this second meaning of decolonization, which is more a process of deconstructing and thinking of the ideologies that manifest into our sector. So today, what I suggested is to really think about what is the colonial legacy of the humanitarian aid sector. What is our historical background? Where do we come from? And this is to understand how does colonialism today, it manifests in the current humanitarian practice? And what are the today's form of structural racism in the humanitarian sector? So that's gonna be for the first part. And then the second part will be to present briefly what is the engagement of the humanitarian sector against inequalities? How has the humanitarian community responded to calls to decolonize aid? And how have organizations tried to address systematic racism? And then we will discuss together about some perspectives and recommendations. Okay. Let's start. I think it's important to start with our historical background and the colonial legacy and history of racial relations. I'm starting on the 19th century to talk about our colonial past, and I'm not talking about since the 15th century, since the slavery trade. So now we are starting in the 19th century. Following the slavery, there was this theorization of race. And why it's important to understand that as humanitarian worker is that it's there that it started, we use to justify colonialism, we use this, let's say, civilization mission that to go to these colonies and to, let's say, liberate these inferior people that comes from the concept of race from their primitive condition. And that was a way as well to justify why we were colonized these countries, to go there to educate these populations. And then in the 20th century, they replace the concept of race by the idea of progress, of development. There were no more, let's say, concept of race, inferiority of people, but there were this perception of beneficiary societies that they should access to a modern future, a more developed, let's say, progress to be in development. And this is based on a Eurocentric vision of progress and modernity. And then following the Second War, there was a rise in power of international and non-governmental organizations. There was this movement of decolonization, but at the meantime, there were a growing of internal organizations that they were producing knowledge, providing technical assistance program to those countries. And they were still implementing this international organization, some programs in former colonies. And there was at that time, some competition with colonial administration as well. And then there was as well this process of decolonization and this tendency of government to respond to crises with humanitarian action. And there was really a blurring of the line between humanitarian and politic actions. That's really to briefly present the historical background in a brief way. But what is important to remember is that the civilizing mission of colonialism is something that is a foundation at some point of the humanitarian action. It evolved for sure. It has been not referring anymore to the concept of race, but then it has been, let's say, it evolved in development and then to providing humanitarian help and support to population.
So if I just put it in a nutshell, which was extremely interesting because I feel like we tend to have a very short memory in our, I think in our world in general, but especially in the humanitarian sector as it's so fast-paced. We went from, it's very extremely simplified, but if understood well, we went from slavery to the concept of race that then turned into access to development with, I think it's very important to stress that the concept of development is European centered or Western centered, that guided all the development initiation at the beginning. And then two key moments where the Second World War in Europe, and then the Cold War issues with the lines between. So the first step is a boom in power for international and non-governmental organizations. That was kind of what I understood, a prolongation of Western states having a hand in areas of conflict. And with the Cold War issues, the lines between independent, neutral aid, international aid, and political concerns that were more and more blurred. Was that a good summary?
Yeah, exactly. That's a good summary. What we need to understand as well, the evolution of the concept of development of race. It's totally different, that's for sure. But there is a continuity of the perception of, let's say, inferior people that we have to educate. That's the issue. I'm not saying that international organization actions are the replication of the colonialism. This is something we will see. What are the difference between them? But it's more about our perception, our concept of development and modern future, without considering that what are their own conception of development. So
it's the underlying vision or the underlying conception of they need something from us. I think it's still, perhaps we'll talk about this at a later stage, but it's still kind of transparent in our vocabulary, like beneficiaries, recipients, and so on. They're in a position of, they're placed very automatically in a lower position and not as equal as right holders. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. That's the main issue.
Okay.
And what the issue is in our modern day practices, and what reinforced the colonial dynamics and belief, and has been raised by some organization when they were talking about the colonization movement, is that there is a denial of the colonial past and the responsibilities we have when we analyze the current context. When we intervene in some countries, we are reading it without considering about what has been done before and what are the consequences, what are the causes of our actions as Western states in that countries. And we are just like presenting humanitarian action as intervening to help the communities. And then there is this quote that which is like really, I think really interesting, that say that amnesia of colonial histories risks turning head into a move to innocence. And that's true that even with my studies in humanitarian action, I've never been, they didn't mention, they didn't make the link between our colonial legacy and the humanitarian action. This is completely distinct. This is completely separate. And yes, so that's really important here to mention that there is this movement of decoloniality, and what they're asking first is the recognition of our colonial past, and then to stop also present humanitarian action as neutral, like without, and to be apolitical, that we have no, that our action is not politic when we are intervening in a country, and then we are completely forgetting, we forgot our past. And even if we are not representing states, because we are a non-governmental organization, we should think of where do we come from? We're still coming from Europe, and there is still this historical background. So when we intervene in some countries, we should consider it. So yeah.
Yeah, super nice. That's very, very interesting. It brings me also the point on neutrality and apolitical characteristic of aid always brings to me the current debate all around neutrality and whether this is an overall, a very broad humanitarian principle that we should keep, or how it should be evolving to best fit the reality of today, and how not taking side is also sometimes serving the oppressor. So for sure, it has been, I understand for some organizations also that neutrality means being able to speak to every party of the conflict and to every side and so on, but most of aid is not neutral, right? Because of our funding, because how we see conflicts and so on. And I think the Ukrainian response is a big illustration of it. But yeah, perhaps a little bit more for the conversation at the end. But yeah, thank you so much for that. Modern day practices and norms that reinforce colonial dynamics and beliefs. That is very enlightening.
Yeah, and there is as well some people I mentioned in that slide, and this is coming from a report from Peace Direct report, which has been organized a lot of roundtable to talk about decolonization movement, and I picked some of quotes from participants from that workshop, and one of the participants said that, why is it that we talk about aid rather than about repair? And I think that's a good point. I mean, at least to recognize that we are responsible as well of the situation, and we are not just coming like like, yeah, because we are empathic, and there is as well some, we are a part, we are responsible of what is going on as well. So I think that's also the term repair, it's also to understand more that that we are here to repair, like, from the violence that has been inflicted by many former states, colonies. So yeah. And to continue with, only to mention some of modern day practices, because there are more, but I choose only to pick some of them, that we can consider that there are norms that reinforce colonial dynamics and beliefs within today practices. As I mentioned before, this idea of progress towards a modern common future, this is still present in our action. There are still these standards, strategies, program design that are mainly based on Western values. The issue as well of decision-making power that are concentrated into the global north. And one of the most important things is that relationships between NGOs and indigenous population, and let's say beneficiaries or population where we intervene, can replicate colonial dynamics. And there is this assumption of a lack of capacity that we can observe in some of our attitude as humanitarian workers. And I mentioned the concept of white gaze. That's quite important here, that we are talking about the manifestation of the white gaze. It's a term for the process by which people and societies are viewed through the lens of a white ethnocentrism. And we assume that as white people, we are the only reference of progress. And then we are putting values, vision of modern future or development based on our conception. And yeah, and this is to make the link of what I've been saying before, that, and this is based on the perceived inferiority of people, and then that they should access to white institutions and norms. And then I wanted also to mention that humanitarian aid and neocolonialism, we have also some, let's say, safeguarding principles. We are also different from this colonial, let's say, dynamics at some point. I think it's important also to mention that, at the contrary, we should mention that international organizations are supposed to be detached from political and state powers. This is based on humanitarian principles, neutrality, impartiality, humanity principle, and this is distinct from other like government actions. We are supposed to be non-governmental and to be independent from state actions, and this is also the basis of humanitarian actions. And this is important to think about it when we are thinking of as humanitarian organization, are they like instruments at the service of states that wish to maintain their domination, or should do we have enough autonomy allowing us to have our own actions, like completely dependent from the government wishes? And there is also another difference from the colonization, is that there is no search for domination. into humanitarian aid sectors. We are there with this objective of humanity, which is helping people without distinction. And there is also this legal framework again, that is based, our action should be based on international laws, and because each government has been signed conventions that we can intervene to protect the rights of individuals. And this is the basis of our actions. So these are some points as well to mitigate what I've said before, just to having a global overview of the issues, and that we have as well some safeguarding principles into humanitarian actions that prevent us to be considered as really instruments of neocolonialism from the states.
So what you're explaining is that humanitarian aid and international humanitarian aid in general is a very different mechanism than from neocolonialism, because we are detached and independent from state powers, because we are obviously not looking for some sort of domination over the population that we are serving. And also because of the legal framework this is all built on and held somehow accountable to, meaning that every organization, every donors and so on are subjected to the approval of the receiving state before you can actually implement in that state, right? I think, but so we have this that is somehow distinguishing the two, which are very different mechanisms. The problematic is that we still have some imprint of colonial period because of our history as a continent, as the global north, as the Western nations, that survives into everything that we do, including international aid, right?
Yeah, exactly. But what you mentioned is really important. I talk about independence and that we are non-governmental organization, but what you pointed out is that also our funds are coming from states. So this is not that simple, but what is important is to keep that in mind in our actions. We are supposed to be non-governmental, but at some point, our actions are funded by states, and we should acknowledge that. We should reinforce our independency, but making sure that it's really we really apply that into practices.
But if we look at it, like I wrote down the quotes from that Peace Direct report that you mentioned. If we think about repair rather than aid, then it would make sense that most donors were Western. The only problematic then is to solve that. It's how to resolve the fact that most of the money is coming from Western nations, but prevent a Western-centered decision mechanisms and criteria and ways of doing and resource sharing and sharing and things like this.
Yeah, and what is hard as well, and what we need to think about is that the donors are selecting the crisis as well. So
absolutely,
it's some state as well that they decided indirectly to intervene. They are intervening, by giving funds. So there are international organizations that are there, and they are non-governmental, but there are also, their actions can only be funded by donors that they decide to fund action in specific countries. So, yeah.
So we need to keep this in mind. I suppose, and I would say wherever we are in the hierarchy of our country-based operations. We're in HQ regional office, local offices with either decision powers position or just project management and so on. I think it's critical that we are aware of this. I assume we'll explore some of the progress that has been made, although very slow, and some of the recommendations that you can share with us. But this whole first part was super important to set the foundations and also bring a little bit of conscious into all those unconscious bias that can develop from just a bias to full-on discrimination and actually rights violation. So thank you for shedding light on some of this problematics, and I'm sure that some of the listeners of yours will take a few notes for their own humanitarian practice.
Welcome. That's I don't have the answer on how to solve that. But
this is a collective effort. I mean, it will take probably a lot of time, but I'm sure in your research you've also kind of found a lot of initiatives and
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. But as we mentioned, I think it's at least to acknowledge that issues and don't think that we are completely apolitical and independent in our actions. That's the first thing we can do, at least.
Yeah.
Yeah. And now I'm talking more specifically about structural racism into humanitarian sectors, which is totally linked with the colonial legacy in the modern era in the humanitarian sectors. I decided to put a picture of Degan Ali, which is a really not say activist, but that's someone who is director of a Somali organization, which is called ADESO in Somalia. And she has been one of the first one as humanitarian worker to criticize the power dynamics in the humanitarian sector. And I choose to mention her and one of her quotes, also to mention when I'm talking about structural racism, what she say is that I'm talking about the systemic structure of power, money, and decision-making that goes into the design of the humanitarian and even aid architecture system. And one of the things that are mentioned about structural racism in the humanitarian sector is the leadership position that are mostly held by white people. And the devaluation of local hiring we can observe. And there is this recruitment bias which favor white people. And another manifestation of the structural racism is also the top-down approach that we have in our actions and failure to make any progress towards localization. And there is this something we already mentioned before, like the prevalence of Western norms, this hierarchy of knowledge and experience from the global north, and then this denial of national and local ownership. And yes, that this is something we will talk about a bit later about this localization process that try to be engaged by the humanitarian sector, which means that to give more ownership of local actors in countries. But this has been, there was a failure of humanitarian sector regarding that.
Yeah, I think it's very important to redefine, and this is what the quote from Degan Ali is re-emphasizing, is what it means structural racism. Because I found, I don't know for you, but in my experience, when we after the Black Lives Matter movement and so on, in 2020, a lot of conversations were sparked in our different organizations, and some voices were starting to be heard for the first time. And we were around tables, and some people just did not understand, or at least were not, I don't know if they were, they just were not capable of even just sitting and listening to colleagues of colors that were shading what was going on in at their own scale in our own very organization, and sometimes like even coordination office or local office. How is this taking life here, and offering some solutions as well, on how it could be changed, or how we should be thinking about it so it would be changed in our level, like very on office scale and so on, and then it could perhaps replicate at the organizational scale. But structural racism, as soon as they were the word racism pronounced, a lot of the managers that were, as you said, mostly older white people, men from a different background, with kind of a different generation and so on, with a different set of ideas. As soon as they heard racism, they took it as if they, as a person, were racist. While what the wave of speeches and you know, like from this calling was more about the structural racism, how this whole system, how it's built, its architectures, its processes, its structures of power, how the money is distributed, where it comes from, how decisions are made, who decides, who is implementing, like how we recruit, as you very well said. This is all built in a certain way, and this is what we have to make the work to understand first, acknowledge, and then contribute to change. Yeah, on the recruitment bias, I have, if I can share an example, a good friend of mine always talks about this 50+ doctor in Central African Republic. He's been in his community for decades. He knows everybody. He has an amazing connection. He's a very skilled medical practitioner and so on. But then he gets not renewed in his position as a medical coordinator in a Western NGO, because he's unable to, in their view, he's unable to fill in a log frame. And I find this example so illustrating one type of structural racism, how we exclude relevant people, experienced people, much more experienced than probably the person who took that decision, just because we have a Western design tool that we impose, that we think needs to be done, and so on. So yeah, I just wanted to share that little example for those who listen, on how this is just one in a million shape of structural racism.
Exactly. Thank you for sharing this example. But yeah, I have as well a lot of examples, like similar example based on my experience, people I met like from countries where we intervened, that they were excellent, but they were not accessing better position. And there was like many reasons given for that. Sometimes no reason at all. And these reasons, they might be corrupted. So that's why we prefer, let's say, expatriate. Expatriate because of corruptions, and because people are coming from the country we intervene, they might be more affected than us. And there are a lot of reasons given, but no one mentioned that this is part of racism. I mean, because, and And this is hard to acknowledge that you are part of a structural racism. But I think it's important to consider it and to change it. And
Yeah.
another,
On this, I also have like a very personal experience. I like to share experiences or examples because it shows that how it can take, like how it is in real life. But on exactly what you just mentioned, like recruiting people from the region or the country that we work in different positions, I actually had a very good staff that was trained and really had all the skills, perhaps like a little bit of experience and so on. But I mean, this is also your job as a manager to grow people into roles, in terms of just necessary skills and so on. But I was asked to do a risk analysis for this person to take that position, that managerial position. And naively, I thought, okay, this is because they can be affected in ways that we maybe not. Like I had seen in different settings, for example, family members of our finance coordinator being kidnapped or so on because they knew he had access to our safe and a lot of cash money and so on. And his position was putting him and his family at some sort of risk. Because he had access of that NGO money, then his family members had been kidnapped for ransom. And so I thought, I mean, coming from that experience, I thought that would be the type of risk analysis, which I find somehow valid because we bring the staff in and assess this together and, see how we can put some mitigation measures so that they're protected in some ways. But no, not at all. It was exactly what you said. It was mostly about corruption, money stealing or diverting and so on, which I found was, yeah, it was really, really hard. And it was even harder to have this type of conversation with the people concerned.
yeah. And another thing as well that can be hard, because based on my personal experience, I started working in the humanitarian sector. I was 24 years old. And at, I don't know, 25, I became a project manager, and my assistant was 50 years old. And she had like 10 years experience working with that project, but she was assistant and she never became project manager. And this started at that time. I thought about it. I didn't put the name racism, but I am one who has been privileged. I benefited from that, which is hard to consider it. But my value was based on my knowledge of how to analyze, how to write a good report. But this person didn't access project manager position because she know the context much better than me and how to run the activities, but she was not that good in writing reports or writing in French. So that's why it's the basis of why, I mean, the justification for me being at that position. And that's also something we need to change. It's stop devaluating context knowledge. I mean, this is really important in our work.
Because we could have thought of the opposite, right? It could have been possible that she was the project manager and you were her assistant, and your task was helping doing the report and so on, and doing the analysis that you pick from your Western academic education, so that it's feeding the criteria that are requested to have the money and so on, which is still, as we've spoken before, a question, like something that we could work on and change, and or at least make evolve a little bit. But it was not even considered, right?
Yeah. And this is something, so I started working, I mean, having these questions in mind, and then in my experiences, I tried at my level to push for local staff to access these positions. But I'm talking at my level, and it should not be like this. I mean, it should be decision from the organization. So that's why we are talking about structural reform. And it should be based on individual decision because they think it's important. This is not enough. And that's why I start to think, okay, but why my organization is not committed to that? Should be a decision as well, a strategic decision to change it. And not
definitely.
Yeah.
And I feel also like a lot of it is people based, but as you say, it's clearly insufficient. Maybe you were able to kind of mitigate a tiny bit this whole structural racism for your own team. And perhaps some of those that are watching or listening to this conversation have also some sort of positive personal experience, but we have to make the effort of just stepping out our own personal individual experience, or the people around us, our friends and so on. Perhaps, yes, your 25, 24 years old manager experience went really, really well. And then you were able to mitigate a little bit of the structural racism at your own, to protect your team a tiny, tiny bit. But just the fact that you're here as a 24, 25 person is a structural racism mechanism. And we need to, it's hard. I mean, I say we need to, but it started with us, right? You and me, we're having this type of conversations. And for me, I have been this 25 years old manager as well. And it is uncomfortable, but we do have to do that. I mean, it's incomparable between the discomfort of the other party in front of us. So this is a responsibility that is on us. And we have to make this effort of stepping out our own individual experience to be able to understand the larger group experience, and acknowledge and work on the structural racism that we are part of, voluntarily or involuntarily, but we have played a role in it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you, Laura. To continue as well with structural racism, I mentioned as well two more things, but there are more, as I mentioned. But structural racism manifests in the humanitarian sector as well. Let's say with this white savior syndrome we can face. This white savior syndrome referred to a person who is generally white and who helps racialized people in a self-serving way. And this is to give oneself a good image, a self-congratulation, rather than supporting a real will of transformation. And it's also to make the link with this civilizing mission we mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. And this white savior syndrome of people coming and having the feeling they are doing good things, but they are not considering people that are in front of them. And they are avoiding questioning their responsibility of a racial, social, and environmental injustice. This is why I wanted to mention this white savior syndrome, because this is something I continue to face in the humanitarian sector with some colleagues. This is not only on personal ways, but as well in communications, in languages we use into that sectors. That language used in communication is fundraising that reinforce discriminatory and racist perception of non-white population, of population that they are described as vulnerable, helpless, powerless, and representation of them in image that are poor, miserable, and yes, that there are still, to me, something that we can that's shock me into that sector, because this is still present, and this is something we can see in fundraising, communication, or languages that we are using on a daily basis as well when we talk about population.
Yeah, it is shocking. It's still, I still have my ears buzz like every time I hear some sort of those words. But I think this language use, this vocabulary that we have and that we should change, in my perspective, in my point of view, could make a whole different, like, we could do a full conversation on this. But if this is something you're interested in, on how and why we should change some of our words, like field, like mission, like vulnerable, the most vulnerable, beneficiaries, recipients, and so on. If this is something you'd like to have in terms of conversations or specific models or master classes, just let us know, and would be very happy with Elisa or you guys to dive in that topic, and also offering alternatives, because I've seen a lot of critics about these words, but rarely have alternatives being offered. So this is something we could work on for you, and yeah, just let us know. Thank you so much, Elisa, so far. I'm looking forward to the next part of this conversation.
Thank you, Laura. So the next part, briefly, is to mention some commitments that has been taken by the humanitarian sector. And I mainly mention what has been decided during the Grand Bargain in 2016 about localization. During this Humanitarian World Summit, humanitarian organizations recognize local actors' value in the effectiveness of humanitarian intervention. They recognize that majority of staff employed in the humanitarian sector were local staff, and that local NGOs were the primary responders to humanitarian crisis. And they committed to allocate 25% of funds to these local NGOs to really increase their capacity to respond to crisis, and to start to shift this power dynamics between international organization and local organization. And we call that the localization process, to give more power to local NGOs. But in practice, there was a failure of localization in practice for many reasons. And one of the main reasons was that it has been decided after this World Summit that it was okay as well to allocate funds to international organizations who were based in some countries of intervention. So meaning that there were no, it was completely a fail to me about giving fundings to local organization, because international organization was able as well to access those funds. And despite as well some commitments of international organizations, and I only mentioned this localization process, but there are more also about that. We can talk about some of the key protection principles, accountability, meaningful participation as well, that once that there is a wish to also give more power to communities, but there are limits and inconsistencies as well in practices, and there are not, in practices we can observe that this is not applied, fully applied by all the organizations in all of their projects. And there is still a lack of consideration of race and marginalized identities. And there is still a lack of engagement and recognition of colonial past from our international organizations.
Yeah. Yeah, because nothing is really easy, right? You would think if it just brings me to all the talk that is going on around the Ukrainian crisis at the moment, and how in the very beginning all money was going directly to Ukrainian organizations, and as soon as the UN and international organizations stepped in, I think it's now 95 or 98% of the money dedicated to the Ukraine population that transit through that is awarded to the UN or the international organizations. And what INGOs do in practice is mostly operate through local partners. So it's just like diluting money and losing money all the way through salaries and so on. While there is necessary some sort of experience sharing, like bilateral learning and so on that can occur there, I understand also the challenges that could be that, okay, you need to meet certain standards of transparency, independence, and so on to be able to receive European or US like government-based money that is that come from the donors that are actually providing this money and so on. But rather than being the assistant and kind of transferring those skills through the organizations on the ground, we do the opposite. We are like of the filter. So I guess it's a very long-term process with a lot of ramification and difficulties and a lot of layers, very, very transversal to do, but the whole structural structural building is to be revised.
Yeah, exactly. And there is a lot to do, I mean, to improve localization. But now, since 2020, a lot of organizations that are calling to for this decolonization movement are saying that localization is not enough. And then we should really consider race and taking the structural racism, and taking out this structural racism. And we should engage more. That localization failed and it's not enough as well. And we should take a step in and go further on that, on that topic.
Okay.
I mentioned like really quickly some initiatives, but there are a lot of more. Just to mention that there are humanitarian organization that started to recognize, to acknowledge this decolonization and structural racism, or they were engaged in localization and they were mentioning some positioning notes and trying to really work on it concretely. So there have been some changes in the past few years. There are also independent initiatives, some denunciation that has been operated from civil society or former humanitarian workers. There are also some research that have been done. A lot of documentation are now accessible into the internet, where you can find a lot of analysis about that topics. And I think we will share as well a list of resources, Laura, about some documents or podcasts, or if you want to have more ideas of what is going on about that, because there are really interesting initiatives and to support organization to change. I'm thinking of some of initiatives that to help like employee if they want to talk about race or racism into their organization, how to do it, how to present that to their organization. And there are some organization consultants that are really supporting NGOs in changing, in really reforming the way they are doing their action, their humanitarian actions.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really important to share. We will share this resource list, so it's just going to be added in the resource box below this video, or near it in the different platforms that you're going to use to view or listen to this conversation. First of all, I think it's super important. Thank you so much for bringing on this decolonization movement, because it is on us to do the work, to educate ourselves, to read in and to learn, and not just to wait and to be taught. So it's very important that you take action, that you act on your own personal bias, and that you contribute to this movement as well at larger scale. If you want, you can. Some examples I'm seeing on the slides are, there are a lot of positioning notes, building forward, localization and decolonization of aid. Care Canada, that has been doing building forward. This report I just mentioned. Alima Amal, changes in the North-South relationship, different independent initiatives. I think everybody has heard with about dignity at MSF, some of the report they've shared as well, Norwegian initiatives as well. I know that, for example, the Danish Refugee Council has also like a little bit in the same model than MSF, like an internal initiative, an internal group that is a working group doing the work for the organization at large, that you can learn from, contribute to, and so on. And there are also a lot of research that you can dive in. I think it's very important that we are able to, even though humanitarians are more in the action part, this action must be informed by longer term studies, sociology, international relationships, and so on, research. So it's, to be effective in the action part, you need to be informed and to keep learning and to keep educate yourself on those themes. So yeah, thank you so much. We'll share that resource list with you guys. Perspectives, love it.
Yeah, is to not to get too much depressed after this presentation. But
bring
yes,
a bit of positive.
Yeah, exactly. I put some of recommendations, but really that's a short list, I admit. But it's really like general ideas. But with the resources we will share, you can find a lot of recommendations and actions you can do at different levels, individually, in your organization, and on a more global level. I think to do a summary of the recommendations, the first thing is the recognition. Recognize structural racism. You can encourage your internal organization culture to be open to criticism, even if it's painful. Okay, but we have to take the problem and shift. Try in your organization to shift power and resources to local actors. Encourage discussion with communities about power dynamics within your project. Also about localization, like reconsider, reevaluate partnerships with local organizations. Be more equitable, encourage mutual accountability, and strengthen local and sustainable decision making with local actors. There are also at organization level things we can do is to stop the practice of white gaze communications and encourage communication through a lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. They are really global ideas, but really what I think is first acknowledge the issues and see what you can do with your organization to put that subject, to put the subject into discussion and to change the strategies as well, push your organization to commit to change.
Yeah, I think it's very important. Like this whole conversation was also about shedding light on the structural systemic issues, but what you just said is, yeah, there are global perspectives and recommendations, but I think they really work at every step of the ladder. And if I were a project manager right now or involved directly with an organization, I think it is possible to use those recommendations of acknowledging the structural racism, so learning to recognize it in your day-to-day practice, to be a voice that encourage an internal organizational culture, to be able to criticism, to yourself be a voice, but to be also a relay of those who don't have a seat at the decision table, to also promote a platform for those who are directly concerned by the issue to express their voice and make every other people around the table listen to them and act, like being able to act on those things that they've heard. I think it would be also, there are some ways of shifting power and resources to local actors in how you design your projects, how you decide on the budget. Like, are you involving communities? Are you involving your team in some ways? And so, I mean, we could brainstorm on how to do this in practice, but immediately when you were talking about it, some ideas popped in my mind, and I'm confident that ideas are also reaching you guys. Yeah, so create a space for change, a space for conversations. It is hard and loaded conversations to have, but it is about time to bring on a little bit of courage, and to shift the tables a tiny bit, and to be able to listen and learn and do the work that we've been missing on so many years. And yeah, challenge the white gaze. Again, with practice, it is feasible, and also being prepared to receive feedback and ask for feedback. I think those recommendations can turn into reality at so many levels of where we work. And I think, like, as an individual, whatever your role is in your team, in your organization, in the whole structure of the humanitarian system at large, there are some things you can do. And I do believe a little bit in the butterfly effect. And I mean, we cannot just wait for the whole system to change. It has to start somewhere, and we need to contribute to it. So yeah, let's have, as a charity so white says, a big vision for a charity sector that is taking the lead to root out racism. So let's have this huge collective global goal. But yeah, it starts with how we show up in the office tomorrow or today even.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. What you shared, this positive feeling there. I do think you're right that after having done this research, that what's important is to think that we still have things we can do about it, and we should do something about it at our level, not waiting, as you mentioned, that there is a global reform. We can participate on it, and that's the most important thing, I think. Yeah, so thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Elisa, for all of this and all the knowledge that you've put into it. It was very informative. It was also triggering in some ways, in a good way, I mean. And it's a great reminder for us, but also some practical ways of taking action have been shared also, which I think is very important for the community that are listening to this type of content in our platforms. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing all of this with us, and for your time and expertise. I just have a little traditional question for all my guests that I want to ask you. So the question is, what was the best professional advice that you have received in your career?
Okay, the thing I have in mind now, I don't know if, yeah, okay. When I was project manager for the first time in Central Africa, the best advice I received was someone from UNICEF, and that came to provide mental health support to my staff, my team. And he told me, like, Elisa, remember that you are asking your team to provide protection support and psychosocial support, but always remember that your team has been affected by the conflict as well, and that they will need always that to take care of them. So that's professional advice I had, like as manager, to always consider the team as people as well who need to be supported as well, to always do as project manager something for the team. So I have this in mind. So yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Elisa.
Thanks, Laura.